we have no f***ing clue who created Spider-Man.
What the hell did you say?
Although the first name that pops into your head is probably Stan Lee, the real answer is a little more complicated. Let's get into it. Before getting his own title, Spider-Man first appeared in Amazing Fantasy issue 15 in 1962, with the story written by Stan Lee and art by Steve Ditko, who also created characters such as Doctor Strange, Squirrel Girl, and even The Question over at DC. But the cover of the book was actually drawn by a different artist, that being Jack the King Kirby, creator of, well, pretty much everything else at Marvel. Oh, and Darkseid over at DC. Stan Lee originally said that the idea for Spider-Man came to him by seeing a fly walking on a wall, and he thought to himself how cool it would be if there was a superhero who could do that. Stan thought about it for a while, coming up with names like Flyman or even Mosquito Man, before settling on Spider-Man, because it sounded more dramatic. Jack Kirby claims to have come up with the original design and the character of Spider-Man. It was absolutely nothing like the one that we have now. The one that he originally created carried a gun, looked more like an adult who was blonde, and didn't even wear a mask properly. There's also an unused cover of Amazing Fantasy 15 that Steve Ditko did, and you can see it here. And honestly, looking at it side by side with the original Jack Kirby work, it is completely different. There's way too much going on in Steve Ditko's version. And honestly, I think that they made the right choice with going with Jack's cover. But he was much too busy working on other Marvel books like the Fantastic Four and others. So, to make work easier for himself, he gave the book to someone else. Someone who wouldn't give him any pushback and could do the job. Steve Ditko. And as for Steve Ditko, he said, well, nothing on it really. He was a very private man and preferred to be behind the scenes. He didn't like talking about himself or things he created. He was there to do his job and didn't really like distractions, so he'd really keep to himself. And he preferred to work in isolation. However, we do know that Steve Ditko had a massive hand in creating the characters and world of Spider-Man, because Marvel, back in the 60s, had a specific method of making comics. Stan Lee was busy writing almost every Marvel comic book at that time, and to actually have time to do all of these different titles, he wouldn't do all of the titles. At least, not at first. Instead, what Stan Lee would do is he would give a general idea of what would happen in the comic books to the artist, with no dialogue or actual plot, and the artist would have to draw the entire book with almost nothing to go on. They would have to take Stan's idea and break it apart across 20 different pages, without any guidelines on how many panels on each page, or exactly how to pace the story, since it wasn't even written at that point. Then after the art was done and finalized, Stan Lee would come in and write the dialogue and the actual story around whatever was drawn. There was actually a small story that was written and drawn in Spider-Man Annual number 1, in which we see the interactions between Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and how toxic of a work environment it really could have been. It depicts Steve Ditko slaving over the pages of the comic book day after day, while Stan Lee wakes up in the middle of the night, calling him and telling him a new idea he has, every day without failure. Stan giving Steve the barest bones of ideas, and making Steve have to go out of his way to figure out how he's actually going to draw this many pages in such a short time. And yes, this is an overdramatization, but we should be looking at this with a little bit of perspective. It is giving us a small snapshot of how Marvel worked back in the 60s. However, what we also have to keep in mind is this is coming from the person who is being pushed to their breaking point. So Steve Ditko might have been skewing things a little bit to make himself seem more sympathetic. However, that doesn't change the fact that, back in the day, the artists were worked to the bone. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds incredibly imbalanced and really in the writer's favor. That's why he was able to do so many comic books and create so many characters throughout the 60s. Because Stan Lee wasn't having to sit down and write every story from beginning to end for every title he was working on. Which, actually, if you think about it, would place a lot more creative responsibility on the artists instead of the writers. And the unfortunate side effect about that is all of the artist's work that was put into the story wouldn't be credited. They would only be put down as penciler, inker, but they wouldn't actually get the recognition they deserved for putting in all of the hard work into building the character's foundations. I want to make something absolutely crystal clear. I'm not accusing Stan Lee of taking credit for anybody else's work. I'm merely pointing out the fact that back in the day, the comic book business was very ruthless. And honestly, if an artist did create a character, they pretty much wouldn't get any kind of recognition for it. They didn't even own the original pages for the books that they worked on. Back then, everything was done on a work-for-hire basis, and they weren't entitled to any extra compensation for any extra sales, toys, movies, anything, as the rights were 100% owned by the companies.
Steve Ditko, as far as I understood it, has lived in some very reduced circumstances throughout his life. When Marvel have been raking in money hand over fist with characters that he created or co-created, but which essentially, in my heart, were Steve Ditko creations.
And unfortunately, that wasn't an exclusive to Marvel. In fact, the same kind of thing happened with Bill Finger over at DC. But in this case, he was actually the writer who created basically everything for Batman, including Commissioner Gordon, Robin, the Batcave, the idea that he even has the cowl and the Batmobile. And Bob Kane basically forced Bill Finger to sign over every bit of creative credit to him. And if you want a visual representation on how different things could have been, here's Bob Kane's original rendition of Batman. And here it is after Bill Finger's influence. Big difference, isn't it? Unfortunately, back at Marvel, Steve Ditko wouldn't get any credit for any work he did on Spider-Man's story, developing the characters, the plots, anything, until issue 25. But at that point, the bridge was pretty much burned between him and Stan, and he ended up stepping away from Spider-Man altogether at issue 38. And the worst part about the entire thing is Steve Ditko got burned so bad that he ended up hating anything involving his legacy in comics. For example, back in the day when Steve Ditko was still alive, you could send him fan mail, and he would actually respond with handwritten letters. And here's an example of this from 2014, where he's responding to a fan who asked him what it's like knowing that his work will always remain in print due to his impact on the comic book world. And his response was as follows. Dear Peter, every new generation has its particular favorites. Comic books have been around for years before Spider-Man. There were a lot of favorite comic books before Spider-Man. There were favorites in daily newspaper strips, movie stars, TV shows. Name the category and there are favorites. From early still photographs to silent movies, to talkies, to color, all types of favorites with crime, romance, piracy, war, science fiction, western, historical, etc. Every new generation will find its own heroes. Favorites as usual. Yours are already in decline. Regards, Steve Ditko.
Emotional damage!
So, it's a new day, and I found more information that makes things just a little more complicated. When doing research for this video, I ended up finding a BBC documentary, which I was able to get pieces from YouTube, in which BBC interviews multiple creators from throughout comic book history, including Stan Lee and Alan Moore, otherwise known as the man who created Watchmen and wrote Batman: The Killing Joke. As it turns out, Alan Moore absolutely confirmed that Stan Lee was more of a figurehead. And actually, let me play this clip of Alan Moore because he explains it better than I can.
I really don't have a great deal of respect for Stan Lee. When you start in the industry, you find out that Jack wasn't jolly, and you find out why, and you find out that Steve wasn't sturdy, and you find out why, and you find out why Stan was smiling.
But as it pertains to Spider-Man, Stan Lee says in this video that he was actually contacted in 1999 by Steve Ditko, when, it turns out, for decades, Stan had been crediting himself as the sole creator of Spider-Man. And after 37 years of not getting the credit he thought he deserved, Steve Ditko drew this page. And needless to say, Stan Lee was not happy about it. In fact, you know what? Let's listen to Stan talk in his own words about it.
Anyway, Steve definitely felt that he was the co-creator of Spider-Man. And that was really, after he said it, and I saw it meant a lot to him, that was fine with me.
But do you yourself believe that he co-created it?
I'm willing to say so.
That's not what I'm asking you, Stan.
No, and That's the best answer I can give you.
So it's a no then, really?
I really think the guy who dreams the thing up created it. You dream it up and then you give it to anybody to draw it.
You can tell that the language is very deliberately used here. And you can honestly tell that he's only crediting Steve Ditko as co-creator to appease him because he doesn't want the fight. And it's pretty evident that he still believes he is the sole creator of the character. But Alan Moore confirms this wasn't just a Steve Ditko situation, that the same thing happened to Jack Kirby.
I met Jack Kirby, Jack Kirby created those characters. I'm inclined to think that he created almost all of them by himself. One of the things that makes me think that is Stan Lee. It's in one of those Origins of Marvel Comics books where he reminisces about how him and Jolly Jack created Captain America. Stan Lee was about 12 when Jack Kirby and Joe Simon created Captain America.
In fact, there are actually images out there, which I'll include right here, of Jack Kirby's artwork for Fantastic Four issue 57, page number 12, where in the illustration, he's actually putting what he thinks the character should say, effectively writing a base plot for the story, where Stan comes in and just polishes it up after the fact. So it's really fair to say that the artists actually did, sometimes, write more of the story than Stan would have wanted you to know. It also has become pretty apparent to me that Steve Ditko left Spider-Man on issue 38 due to political differences with Stan Lee. Nothing related to the civil rights movement or any kind of war. In fact, it was more good versus evil fundamentally. Because Steve Ditko identified as an objectivist, somebody who only sees things in black and white, with no shades of moral gray. But don't just take my word for it. Here's rare audio of Steve Ditko himself talking about his outlook on good versus evil.
The creators of flawed ideals believe that no real difference exists between a flawed hero and a flawed villain. Both have some good and some bad in them, so they blend into a grayness where no one is better than anyone else, and where the worst can justifiably claim that he is as good as gray as the best. If it is impossible to know what is true and to do what is right, then the flaw, the worst, will be the new standard of good. Man will be defined as a flawed, anti-rational animal, and all that corrupts and harms life will be the new virtues.
So let's do a little bit of a thought experiment. Put yourself in Steve Ditko's shoes. Your core belief is there is only good and only evil. No gray zone at all. And you've been working with somebody who's been taking credit of all of the ideas and hard work that you've put in for years at this point. And you don't even start getting an inkling of the recognition you deserve until 25 issues in. With somebody who's been documented as calling you all through the night, forcing you to work well beyond your means, making you do extra pages and then telling you to redraw them while you're coming up with the basic plot of the stories and they just come in to do the finishing touches. It absolutely makes sense that he would have a massive level of frustration about the entire scenario. And it makes sense as to why Steve Ditko treated his work in comic books as such a touchy subject up until the moment he passed. I mean, Steve Ditko didn't even accept the fact that Stan Lee credited him as a co-creator because he said he considered him to be, not that he was, leaving the possibility of a interpretation. But like I said before, we'll never really get to the bottom of what really happened and how much each person actually contributed, as they're all gone.